My husband and his best friend made a joke over Christmas dinner, betting I'd break down when divorce papers were slid across the table. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I signed. What I gave them next stopped the room cold. Before I tell you how that moment was planned, take a second to support stories like this. Then stay with me, because the ending flips everything. Before I tell you everything, do me a quick favor. Tap subscribe and comment where you're watching from, so this story reaches more people. Now let's begin. I heard my husband's laughter before I heard the words. That soft, careless sound drifting from the living room. The kind that always meant he felt untouchable. Then his friend laughed too, louder, sharper, like a dare sealed with alcohol and arrogance. She'll break, my husband said. She always does. I stood frozen in the hallway, a tray of drinks trembling in my hands, my pulse roaring so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Divorce papers, Christmas dinner, a bet on my tears. That was the plan. They didn't know I'd already stopped crying months ago. And before I go any further, if you believe no one should be humiliated inside their own home, take a second to support stories like this. Your presence here matters more than you know. The truth is, nothing truly begins at the moment of betrayal. It begins much earlier, disguised as jokes, wrapped in smiles, softened by public laughter. My husband, Evan to the world, but something colder behind closed doors, had always enjoyed reminding people how replaceable I was. You know I could leave tomorrow, right? He'd say at dinner parties, arm draped around my shoulder like a trophy. Everyone laughed, including me, because that's what you do when someone teaches you that discomfort is invisible if you smile through it. At home, the comments sharpened. Don't talk like that in front of my colleagues. You're lucky I tolerate you. Be honest. What would you even do without me? Never shouted, never screamed. Evan was far too polished for that. His cruelty came dressed as humor, slipped into conversation like seasoning. Just enough to sting, never enough to call out. I learned to shrink without realizing I was doing it. My red dresses disappeared from my closet. My opinions softened into questions. My world narrowed to the size of his approval. Friends noticed before I did. My childhood friend, Claire, once pulled me aside at a barbecue and whispered, "You're fading." I laughed it off. I defended him. I defended the marriage. I defended the lie that stability meant silence. But something shifted the night he mocked me at a corporate gala, wine on his breath, contempt in his eyes. "Always wanting more," he muttered. Clinging. That night, when we got home, he drank himself into a stupor and passed out on the couch. And for the first time, instead of crying, I did something else. I suggested paperwork. Not divorce. Not separation. Just a joke, I said. A what if? He laughed, scribbled his signature on a napkin, mocked me for being dramatic, and forgot about it by morning. I didn't. Within 24 hours, that napkin became a legal document. Properly witnessed, properly filed, reinforced later with clauses he never bothered to read. I didn't feel powerful doing it. I felt calm. Calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. From that day on, I stopped reacting. I started observing. I kept records, not out of anger but clarity. Dates, words, patterns, the perfume on his shirts. The receipts that didn't match his excuses. The way his phone lit up at night with names saved as initials. I didn't confront him. I cooked his favorite meals. I laughed at his jokes. I became the version of myself he found easiest to underestimate. He thought he was winning. By the time December arrived, he was careless, confident. His cruelty grew bolder because he believed I was cornered. That's when I saw the message on his unlocked phone. 2 weeks before Christmas. She doesn't suspect a thing. Filing on Christmas. Want front row seats. I read it twice. Then I closed the phone and went to bed. Christmas dinner was perfect. Immaculate. Candles glowing. Family laughing. Evan carved the turkey like a king presiding over his feast. He winked at me across the table, smug and certain. Then he stood, tapped his glass, and handed me the envelope. Divorce papers. Already signed. Already filed. He waited for tears. I smiled instead. I signed without hesitation and slid the papers back across the table. Then I placed my gift in front of him. A gold-wrapped box, heavier than it looked. When he opened it, the room went silent. Recognition hit him first. Then disbelief. Then fear. It was the agreement he'd laughed through. Signed. Dated. Locked in. Every asset. Every condition. His handwriting everywhere. He looked up at me like he'd never seen me before. And that's when I placed the final envelope on the table. The one that changed the air in the room completely. I'm pregnant, I said quietly. No shouting. No theatrics. Just truth, delivered with precision. The power didn't snap, it drained. Slowly. Publicly. Permanently. He left that night without a word. I slept for the first time in years. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Locks changed. Paperwork finalized. Messages ignored. His confidence collapsed in real time, unraveling through lawyers' calls and missed payments. I rebuilt slowly. Intentionally. A nursery painted in colors he once mocked. Mornings without fear. Silence that felt like peace instead of punishment. When my daughter kicked for the first time, I cried, not from pain but relief. She would never grow up watching her mother disappear. A year later, I held her on my chest at a small Christmas table, surrounded by people who spoke gently and laughed without cruelty. No performances. No power games. He once said I'd be nothing without him. Turns out, I became everything the moment I stopped trying to survive his shadow. And this was only the beginning. The silence after Evan left wasn't empty. It was loud in its own way, filled with things I'd never been allowed to hear before. My own breathing, the creak of the house settling, the quiet hum of the refrigerator at night. For years, silence had meant tension. Now it meant safety. The next morning, I woke up before dawn without dread pressing on my chest. No calculating his mood. No rehearsing my words. Just the soft light creeping through the curtains and a strange, unfamiliar feeling. Ownership of my own time. I moved slowly through the house, barefoot on cold floors, taking inventory of everything he no longer controlled. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon from the candles I'd lit the night before. His mug sat in the sink, untouched. I didn't wash it. I didn't need to erase him all at once. Some things lose power simply by being ignored. By mid-morning, the calls started. First from his mother. I let it ring. Then his father. Straight to voicemail. Then his best friend, the same one who'd laughed about my tears. I blocked the number without listening. Evan tried last. 3 calls. Then a message. You blindsided me. I stared at the words for a long moment before setting the phone face down. The audacity almost made me laugh. For years, I'd lived inside surprises he carefully engineered, shifts in tone, moving goalposts, rules that changed without warning. And now, because I refused to perform grief on schedule, he felt betrayed. By noon, my lawyer confirmed what I already knew. The agreement held. Ironclad. His signature had done the work for me long before he ever imagined consequences. You were meticulous, she said. He underestimated you. Everyone did. The following weeks passed like slow exhalations. I moved through them, deliberately. I didn't rush to tell my side of the story. I didn't defend myself. I let his version echo into rooms that were no longer mine to manage. Friends chose sides quietly. Some disappeared. Some returned with apologies heavy with regret. One afternoon, I ran into Evan outside a bank downtown. He looked thinner, tired. His confidence, once so loud it filled every room, now sat awkwardly on his shoulders like a suit that didn't fit anymore. He didn't see me at first. When he did, he froze. I nodded politely and kept walking. That moment told me everything I needed to know. The power he'd relied on had only ever existed because I'd been willing to absorb it. Without my reactions, he had nothing to push against. At home, The nursery began to take shape. Soft colors, natural light. A rocking chair assembled badly by a cousin who made me laugh so hard I cried. I started sleeping diagonally across the bed, claiming space without apology. When my daughter arrived, the world narrowed in the best way. Her weight on my chest, her breath warm and uneven, her tiny fingers curling around mine like a promise. I didn't think about Evan that day, or the next. It wasn't until months later, when paperwork was finalized and the dust had truly settled, that I learned what had happened on his end. Promotions lost, invitations withdrawn, friends who no longer laughed at his jokes. Control doesn't age well once it's exposed. One evening, as I rocked my daughter to sleep, I realized something that startled me with its simplicity. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was living. No strategies, no contingency plans, no emotional armor, just a life that finally belonged to me. And that was when I understood the truth Evan never would. I hadn't taken anything from him. I'd simply stopped giving. The first letter arrived without warning. It wasn't from Evan. I would have recognized that handwriting anywhere. Tight, aggressive strokes, like every word was trying to dominate the page. This envelope was different. Cream paper, neat cursive, no return address. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the counter and went about my morning routine, the one I'd built carefully since reclaiming my life. Coffee first, then sunlight, then my daughter, still half asleep, curled against my shoulder as if she trusted the world simply because I existed in it. Only after she was settled did I slit the envelope open. It was from his mother. Not an apology, not anger either. Something worse, revision. She wrote about misunderstandings, about how Evan had been under pressure, about how marriages required grace. She never once mentioned the dinner, or the laughter, or the bet placed on my pain like entertainment. Instead, she asked if I was open to talking. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a drawer I labeled closed chapters. Some conversations don't deserve oxygen, but the letter was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, his name started surfacing in places I didn't expect. Mutual acquaintances, old colleagues, people who suddenly just wanted to check in. They weren't concerned. They were curious. Had I really planned everything? Was I always like this? Did Evan see it coming? I answered none of it, because the truth was simple. The version of me they were trying to understand no longer existed for public analysis. One afternoon, while grocery shopping, I overheard two women whispering near the produce aisle. I didn't need to turn around to know they were talking about me. I'd learned the sound of speculation, the hushed tones, the pauses, the half-sentences. She didn't even cry, one of them said. The other replied, "That's what scares people." I smiled to myself as I picked up apples. They were right about one thing. The absence of tears unsettles those who rely on them. That night, my lawyer called. Evan's trying to renegotiate. I laughed softly. Of course he is. He's claiming emotional manipulation. That made me stop. On whose part? I asked. Yours, she said carefully. He says you orchestrated everything, that you misled him. I stared at the wall, at the framed photo of my daughter's first smile. And he has no evidence. None. But desperation makes people loud. Desperation also makes people reckless. 2 days later, I received the email. It was forwarded anonymously. No message, just an attachment. Screenshots. Messages Evan had sent to friends, to coworkers, to people he thought were allies. Complaints. Accusations. Claims that I had entrapped him. That I had pretended for years. The irony was almost poetic. He'd built his identity on control, and now that control was collapsing inward, turning on him. But buried in those messages was something else. A name I didn't recognize, and a date. My breath slowed as I read further. The messages referenced documents, financial conversations, plans that predated the dinner. predated even the napkin. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. Her response came fast. "This changes things." I sat down, because suddenly the story wasn't just about cruelty masked as humor. It was about intent. And intent has consequences. That night, after my daughter fell asleep, I opened the old journal I'd kept during the final months of my marriage. The one filled with dates, comments, moments that had seemed small at the time. I flipped to an entry I'd almost forgotten. A sentence Evan had said once, laughing, when he thought I wasn't listening. "If this ever ends, I'll make sure I land on my feet." I closed the journal. He had never planned to fall, and that was exactly why he was now. The name wouldn't leave my mind. I read it again, slower this time, letting each letter settle. It wasn't familiar, yet Evan had written it with confidence, as if the person were central to a plan already in motion. Dates followed the name. Locations, casual mentions buried inside jokes and complaints, the way men talk when they assume no one is listening closely. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, but from recognition. I'd felt this before. That subtle shift when something half-seen finally sharpens into focus. The same feeling I'd had months ago, standing in the hallway with a tray of drinks, listening to them wager on my reaction. Back then, the realization had been personal. This one felt larger. The next morning, I met my lawyer in her office earlier than scheduled. She'd already printed the screenshots, spread neatly across the conference table like puzzle pieces. "He wasn't improvising," she said, tapping one page with her pen. "He was laying groundwork." "For what?" I asked. She looked up at me. "For a narrative where you lose credibility." I leaned back slowly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. "How long?" "Longer than you think." She slid another document toward me. Public records she'd pulled after seeing the name. Corporate filings. Shell partnerships. Quiet transfers that didn't raise alarms unless someone knew where to look. "He expected you to fold," she continued. "When you didn't, he pivoted." I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief. Not anger. Clarity. "So this wasn't about humiliating me," I said. "That was just practice." She didn't correct me. That afternoon, I took my daughter for a walk through the park. The trees were shedding leaves in slow spirals, the air crisp and clean. Parents chatted on benches. Dogs tugged at leashes. Life continued, blissfully unaware of the storm that had once defined my world. I watched my daughter's face as she tracked the movement of birds overhead. Wonder without fear. Trust without calculation. That was when the decision settled fully into my bones. I wasn't going to rush this. Rushing was his language. Pressure. Deadlines. Forced reactions. I would move differently. Over the next week, I became invisible on purpose. No responses. No public appearances. No correcting rumors. I let speculation burn itself out while I worked quietly behind the scenes. Records were requested. Timelines mapped. Conversations cross-checked. Patterns emerged. The name I didn't recognize belonged to someone Evan had been speaking to regularly. Someone positioned to benefit if certain assets shifted hands under specific circumstances. Someone who disappeared from correspondence the moment the dinner imploded. Someone who assumed I would be too busy unraveling to notice. One evening, my phone rang from an unlisted number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. "Careful. Please call me. There are things you should know." The voice was unfamiliar. Controlled. Not Evan. I listened twice. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer. Her reply came minutes later. "Do not call back. Let them come to us." 2 days later, a formal request arrived for mediation. Not reconciliation. Not negotiation. Containment. They wanted to settle outstanding concerns quietly before matters became complicated. I smiled when I read that word. Complicated was what happened when plans met resistance. That night, I stood in my daughter's room long after she'd fallen asleep. The soft rhythm of her breathing anchored me to the present, to what mattered. Evan had once told me I was too emotional to handle complexity, too sentimental to think strategically. He'd mistaken patience for weakness. What he never understood was this. I wasn't dismantling his story to punish him. I was dismantling it to make sure it could never be used against anyone else. And somewhere I knew he was starting to realize the same thing. Because the calls stopped, the letters stopped, and silence returned, but this time not the kind that waits, the kind that watches. Silence has weight when it's deliberate. For nearly 10 days after the mediation request, nothing happened. No messages, no legal pressure, no anonymous emails. Evan vanished from my immediate orbit so completely that if I hadn't known better, I might have believed he'd finally accepted defeat. But men like him don't retreat. They reposition. The first sign came from an unexpected place. My accountant called on a Tuesday afternoon, voice unusually careful. I received an inquiry, she said. Not formal. More like fishing. From whom? I asked. She hesitated. A private firm. They claimed to be conducting a routine review connected to Evan's past financial disclosures. They asked if I still represented you. That confirmed it. He was trying to widen the frame, shift attention, introduce doubt where there had been none. Did you answer? I asked. I told them all communication goes through counsel, she said. And then I called you. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing for a long moment. The house was quiet except for the dishwasher, humming softly. My daughter napped upstairs, unaware of how close old shadows still hovered at the edges of our lives. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure folder my lawyer and I shared. The one labeled simply Timeline. Every entry was there. Dates, screenshots, audio files, witness names, not emotional recollections, facts. Evan had underestimated one thing consistently. I never forgot details. That evening, I received another voicemail. Different number. Same voice as before. This isn't hostile, the man said calmly. But the longer this stays unresolved, the more people it affects. People. Such a vague word. It always is when responsibility feels inconvenient. I forwarded the message, without comment. The response from my lawyer came back with a single sentence. They're nervous. 2 days later, she explained why. The name I hadn't recognized, the one buried in Evan's messages, had a history. Not criminal, not overtly illegal, but adjacent. Always just close enough to questionable situations to benefit, never close enough to take the fall. He was insurance, my lawyer said. A backup narrative. If Evan needed to frame events as mutual or coercive or manipulated, this person would have helped support that story. And now? I asked. And now, she said, that person wants distance. That was when it clicked. Evan hadn't just lost control over me. He'd lost control over the people who believed his version of events was airtight. Pressure was building from directions he hadn't planned for. I declined the mediation, formally. No counteroffer. No explanation. That night, I dreamed of the Christmas table again. Not the moment of confrontation, but the seconds just before. The warmth. The illusion. The way everyone believed the story unfolding was safe because it followed familiar patterns. I woke with certainty burning in my chest. I wasn't done. The following week, a package arrived by courier. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. You deserve to know the whole picture. I didn't touch it until my lawyer was present. When we reviewed the contents together, the room grew very still. Emails, recorded calls, internal memos. Not mine, Evan's. Conversations where he spoke openly about timing, leverage, public perception. About making sure I didn't get too confident. One file stood out. Dated months before Christmas. I'll do it during the holidays, his voice said, clear and unmistakable. Public setting. Witnesses. She'll fold. My lawyer closed the laptop slowly. That, she said, changes everything. Because now there was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no rewritten history. What he'd framed as spontaneity had always been planned, and planning leaves footprints. That evening, after my daughter fell asleep, I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, Evan was likely pacing, trying to predict my next move the way he always had. He still thought this was a game of reactions. He still believed silence meant uncertainty. What he didn't know was that the moment he bet on my pain, he'd already lost. He just hadn't felt it yet. I didn't sleep much after that. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was finally free to connect dots without second-guessing myself. For years, I'd been trained to doubt my instincts, to soften my certainty, to ask permission even inside my own head. Now there was nothing blurring the edges. Every memory lined up cleanly, painfully clear. The next morning, my lawyer called before I'd finished my coffee. We need to move carefully, she said, but you now have leverage he never anticipated. I don't want leverage, I replied. I want closure. She was quiet for a beat. Those two things don't always look the same. By noon, she'd assembled a small team, discreet, precise, people who ask questions once and listen the rest of the time. They didn't dramatize what they saw. They didn't gasp. They simply cataloged. That told me everything. The recordings from the flash drive weren't emotional rants. They were calm, strategic. Evan's voice was measured, confident, almost bored, as if he were discussing logistics instead of dismantling a person's life. One file played longer than the others. If she signs quietly, great, he said. If not, I'll make sure she looks unstable. People believe patterns, not protests. I closed my eyes. He hadn't just planned the moment. He'd planned the aftermath. The calls, the whispers, the reframing. All of it designed to make sure that even if I survived, I wouldn't be believed. That was when something in me hardened, not into anger, but resolve. I agreed to one thing only, a formal disclosure. Not public. Not yet. But documented. My lawyer sent a notice requesting sworn statements from Evan and 2 associated parties regarding premeditation and third-party coordination. The language was neutral, professional, devastating, because it forced a choice. Deny under oath, or tell the truth and unravel everything. Evan responded within hours. Not through lawyers. Through me. The message arrived just after midnight. You've taken this too far. I stared at the screen, struck by how familiar the phrasing was. He'd used it countless times before, whenever I'd dared to question him, whenever I'd crossed an invisible line he refused to define. Too far had always meant beyond his reach. I didn't reply. The next message came minutes later. You don't understand what you're risking. That one almost made me laugh. The following morning, the formal reply arrived from his legal team. Short, defensive, vague. They requested time. Time was the one thing I was no longer willing to donate. Within days, the tone shifted again. A new proposal. Softer language. Emphasis on privacy. On moving forward. On mutual dignity. My lawyer slid the document across the table and watched my face carefully. They want you quiet, she said. I nodded. I know. What do you want? I thought of my daughter, of the world she would grow up in, of how often women were taught to accept peace at the cost of truth. I want the record straight, I said, even if no one ever reads it. We countered with a single condition, acknowledgement, not apology, not compensation, acknowledgement of intent. That was the line Evan couldn't cross without destroying the version of himself he'd spent years protecting. Days passed, then weeks, and finally cracks. One of the associated parties withdrew representation. Another requested separate counsel. The network Evan had built to cushion his fall was dissolving, thread by thread. One afternoon, as I pushed my daughter's stroller through the neighborhood, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "This is Evan," he said. No greeting. No warmth. I stopped walking. "You don't get to call me," I said calmly. Silence stretched between us. "I never meant for it to go this way," he said finally. I closed my eyes. "That," I replied, "is the only part you planned." I hung up before he could respond. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because I knew something he didn't. The story was no longer his to control, and soon he would have to live with that. The aftermath of that call didn't arrive with noise. It came quietly, the way truth often does when it's finally done waiting. 3 days after Evan tried to reach me, my lawyer received what she'd been expecting, but not so soon. A revised statement, carefully worded, stripped of bravado, heavy with qualifiers. Not a confession, but not a denial either. It was the legal equivalent of blinking first. "He's testing the ground," she told me over the phone, "seeing how much you'll accept without pushing further." "I won't," I said, and surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. That afternoon, I took my daughter to the library for the first time. She was still too young to understand the books, but she loved the colors, the hushed voices, the sense of calm. I held her close as we moved between shelves, thinking about how different her world would be from the one I'd navigated for so long. She would never be told her reactions were liabilities. She would never be trained to shrink. She would never confuse silence with safety. When we got home, another email was waiting. This one wasn't from Evan's lawyer. It was from someone else involved, one of the names that had surfaced quietly in the background, the one who'd gone silent after Christmas. The subject line was blunt. "I need to protect myself." The message was long, careful, afraid. They didn't apologize. They explained. They explained how Evan had framed the situation as inevitable, how he described me as emotional, unstable, incapable of rational decisions, how he'd promised everything would resolve quickly once I reacted the way people expected. They explained why they'd believed him, and then, buried near the end, was the sentence that mattered most. I can attest that the timing and setting were planned. I forwarded the email immediately. My lawyer called within minutes. "That's corroboration," she said. "Independent." I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. The final piece sliding into place. From that moment on, things accelerated. Requests turned into demands. Demands turned into urgency. The people who'd once benefited from Evan's certainty were now scrambling to distance themselves from it. He stopped reaching out, not because he'd accepted responsibility, but because he'd run out of moves. Weeks later, a final agreement was drafted. It included what I'd insisted on from the beginning, a formal acknowledgement, sealed and recorded, detailing the premeditated nature of the event and the attempt to influence perception afterward. It wouldn't make headlines, it wouldn't trend, but it would exist, and that mattered. The day it was signed, I didn't feel victorious. I felt light, as if I'd been carrying something heavy for years without realizing how deeply it weighed on me. That evening, I sat on the floor of my daughter's room while she played with a soft block, her laughter filling the space. I thought about how many versions of myself had existed inside that marriage, how many had gone quiet so this one could finally speak. Evan faded into memory the way storms do once the air clears, still part of the landscape, no longer defining it. Months later, I heard he'd moved, changed jobs, started over somewhere new. I hoped he would tell the story differently there, that he would learn. But whether he did or not was no longer my concern, because the most important truth had already been secured. Not that I was strong, not that I was clever, but that I had been aware all along. And awareness, once reclaimed, doesn't go back to sleep. Life didn't return to normal after everything settled. It moved forward, but in a way that felt quieter, deeper, like a river that had carved a new path beneath the surface. I stopped measuring my days by what I'd survived and started noticing what I was building instead. The first real shift came when people stopped asking about Evan. Not abruptly, gradually. His name slipped out of conversations the way outdated headlines do, replaced by new gossip, new scandals, new distractions. I noticed the absence more than the presence. It was proof that what once felt permanent had always been temporary. One afternoon, while my daughter slept against my chest, I reread the sealed acknowledgement for the last time. The language was sterile, legal, bloodless, but between the lines lived something undeniable. Truth doesn't need embellishment once it's documented. I filed it away and never opened it again. Around that time, women began reaching out. Not publicly, not loudly. Quiet messages, emails sent late at night. Conversations that started with, "I don't know why I'm telling you this," and ended with confessions they'd never said out loud before. They recognized something in my story, not the dinner, not the documents, not even the outcome. They recognized the moment before. The moment when instinct whispers, but fear tells you to be polite. One woman wrote that her husband joked about leaving her whenever she disagreed. Another said her partner liked to test her reactions in front of others, calling it humor. A third admitted she'd started recording arguments just to reassure herself she wasn't imagining things. I read every message slowly. I responded to none immediately, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. When someone is finally ready to see clearly, they don't need answers yet. They need validation. So when I did reply, I kept it simple. "You're not imagining it." Those 4 words changed more lives than I expected. I didn't set out to become anything to anyone. I didn't brand my experience. I didn't tell my story publicly. But silence has a way of echoing louder than noise. An invitation arrived in the mail one morning. Thick paper, understated design. A private forum. Small audience. Closed doors. They wanted me to speak, not about Evan, but about preparation. Awareness. Quiet exits. I almost said no. Old instincts flared. The ones that warned against visibility, against being seen as difficult or dramatic. Then I looked at my daughter playing on the floor, fearless in her joy, and I said yes. The room was small. No cameras, no recording devices, just women seated in a loose circle, some confident, some trembling, all listening intently. I didn't rehearse. I told them the truth, not the dramatic version, not the polished one. I told them how I'd learned to stay calm under ridicule, how laughter had once disguised cruelty so effectively that even I questioned myself, how preparation had begun not with anger, but with clarity. When I finished, no one clapped. They sat in silence, and then one woman spoke. I thought I was weak because I was quiet. I shook my head. "No," I said. "You were observant." That word landed differently. I saw it on their faces. Observant didn't sound like a flaw. After that, invitations came more frequently. Always discreet. Always controlled. I chose carefully. This wasn't about exposure. It was about recalibration. Evan had once told me my greatest weakness was my restraint. He had been catastrophically wrong. Because restraint, when paired with awareness, becomes power. And power, once understood, doesn't announce itself. It waits. After the first forum, I expected the feeling to fade. Moments like that usually do. Intense, emotional, then distant once routine reclaims its place. But this one lingered. Not like adrenaline, more like alignment. As if something that had been out of place for years had finally clicked into position. I went home that night quieter than usual. My daughter slept in her crib. One small fist curled against her cheek. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of her chest, thinking about the kind of silence I wanted her to grow up knowing. Not the tense kind that waits for an explosion. The safe kind. The kind that means nothing bad is coming. The next morning, my phone held 3 new messages from women who had attended the forum. None of them thanked me. They didn't call me brave or strong. Instead, they wrote things like, "I noticed something last night. I went home and listened differently. I stopped explaining myself." Those messages mattered more than praise ever could. Weeks passed, and my life settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Morning walks, work done in focus blocks while my daughter napped, evenings filled with music I chose, food I enjoyed, conversations that didn't require monitoring. And yet, the past had not fully released its grip. One afternoon, as I was leaving a small cafe downtown, I saw Evan again. He stood across the street, half hidden by a bus shelter, speaking into his phone with sharp gestures. He looked thinner still, his posture no longer relaxed, but defensive, like someone bracing for impact that never quite arrives. I didn't slow down. I didn't look away either. For a brief second, our eyes met. Something flickered across his face, recognition, then something else. Calculation, perhaps, or regret. It didn't matter. I crossed the street in the opposite direction and kept walking. Later that day, my lawyer called with an update I hadn't been expecting. "He's trying to reverse engineer your silence," she said. I smiled faintly. "How?" "He's telling people you've moved on completely, that you were never really affected." "That's fine," I replied. She paused. "You're not worried?" "No," I said honestly. Let him tell that story. Because the truth was he needed me to look untouched. It protected him from acknowledging what he'd done. If I wasn't harmed, then he wasn't harmful. That lie would carry him only so far. A few days later, a woman named Clara reached out to me privately. She'd been referred by someone I'd spoken with months earlier. Her message was short and restrained, but something in the phrasing caught my attention. "He's careful in public," she wrote, "but different at home." We met in a neutral place, a sunlit corner of a public library, 2 strangers sharing a table large enough to keep distance. Clara spoke slowly, choosing her words like someone who'd been corrected too often for speaking the wrong way. As she talked, patterns emerged, jokes framed as lessons, humiliation softened with smiles, tests disguised as affection. My chest tightened, not with memory, but with recognition. When she finished, she looked at me and asked the same question I'd once asked myself. Am I overreacting? I met her gaze steadily. What happens when you trust your instinct? She hesitated. I feel clearer and scared. That's awareness, I said. Fear comes later. She exhaled shakily, as if she'd been holding her breath for years. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't give her a plan. I simply told her what I wished someone had told me sooner. Start documenting. Not because you're planning to leave, but because you deserve clarity. When she left, I sat alone for a long time, staring at the dust motes drifting through the sunlight. This wasn't something I'd sought out. I wasn't trying to become a guide or a symbol, but silence, once broken, invites echoes. That night, as I rocked my daughter to sleep, I realized something quietly monumental. Evan had believed power lived in spectacle, in public moments, in reactions he could witness and control. He never understood the quieter kind, the kind that spreads without announcement, the kind that changes rooms he'll never enter again. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't think of what I was doing as helping at first. That word felt too big, too polished. What I was actually doing was listening, without interrupting, without correcting, without softening the edges of what women were finally brave enough to say out loud. Listening changes things. Once people realize they won't be rushed into conclusions or pushed toward decisions they aren't ready for, they start telling the truth more clearly, not dramatically, not all at once, but in fragments that, when placed together, reveal patterns no single moment ever could. The messages multiplied slowly, never in waves, always one at a time. A woman who had started hiding cash in a library book because her partner tracked every transaction. Another who noticed her husband only praised her in public after humiliating her in private. One who realized she hadn't laughed freely in years because laughter could be misinterpreted as defiance. I kept everything confidential. No names, no sharing, no commentary beyond what was asked. What surprised me most was how often the same phrase appeared, almost word for word. I thought it was just me. That belief that isolation is personal failure is the most effective control mechanism of all. I began keeping a private notebook. Not evidence, not records, observations. How often manipulation hid behind humor. How frequently power announced itself as concern. How easily people dismissed discomfort if no visible harm followed. Patterns don't need villains to exist. They just need silence. One evening, after putting my daughter to bed, I reread the earliest entries from my old journal, the one I'd kept during the final year of my marriage. I hadn't opened it in months. The handwriting changed noticeably from page to page. Early entries tentative, apologetic. Later ones sharp, precise. There was a line I'd underlined heavily back then. He jokes, so no one notices I'm shrinking. I traced the words with my finger. I wasn't shrinking anymore. A week later, I was invited to speak again. This time to a group that wasn't exclusively women. Professionals, advisors, people whose job titles included words like ethics and compliance. I hesitated. Visibility carries risk, even when intentions are pure. But the invitation wasn't about my story. It was about recognizing early indicators of coercive behavior before it escalates into something undeniable, and therefore harder to stop. I agreed under one condition. No mention of names. Not mine. Not his. The room was larger this time. Brighter. More formal. People took notes. I spoke calmly, deliberately, about how humiliation doesn't need raised voices. How jokes can be rehearsed weapons. How timing is often the giveaway. Cruelty delivered when witnesses are present. Kindness restored once the audience leaves. I watched faces change as recognition dawned. Afterward, a man approached me. Middle-aged. Polite. Careful. I think I missed something, he said quietly. In my own behavior. That was the moment I understood the reach of what was happening. This wasn't about blame. It was about awareness disrupting comfort. Not everyone welcomed that. A few days later, I received my first critical message. It accused me of exaggeration, of encouraging paranoia, of rewriting personal conflict as abuse. I read it once and deleted it, not because it didn't sting, but because it confirmed something important. Truth always feels threatening to those invested in the old narrative. Evan crossed my mind that night, not with anger, but with a distant curiosity. I wondered if he'd heard whispers of what I was doing, if he recognized himself in the descriptions circulating quietly through rooms he no longer controlled. If he did, he said nothing. And that silence told me more than any confrontation ever could. The next morning, Clara sent me a message. I asked a question last night, she wrote. Just one. And the reaction told me everything. I smiled softly. Questions are powerful. They don't accuse. They illuminate. As I closed my phone and looked around my home, sunlight on the walls, toys scattered without apology, peace unguarded, I realized something fundamental had shifted. My life was no longer defined by what I had endured. It was shaped by what I refused to ignore. And that kind of clarity doesn't fade. It spreads. The pushback didn't come loudly. It came sideways through suggestions, tone shifts, polite concern. The kind of resistance that smiles while it questions your credibility. A colleague of someone I'd spoken with asked if I worried about misinterpretation. Another wondered aloud whether conversations like these might encourage instability. The words were familiar. I'd heard versions of them before, delivered with the same gentle authority meant to close discussions without appearing to do so. I listened. I nodded. I didn't retreat, because I understood the real fear wasn't misinformation. It was loss of control. When people start naming patterns, those who rely on ambiguity lose their advantage. The first article appeared online a month later. It wasn't about me. It referenced no names. But the language was unmistakable. Discussions of subtle coercion in professional households, of public humiliation masked as humor, of power exercised through timing rather than force. I read it twice, slowly. Someone else was saying it now. That was when the emails changed. Not pleas, not confessions, questions. How do you know when it's crossed a line? What if nothing bad enough has happened yet? Why does it feel wrong even when I can't explain why? I answered carefully, briefly, always with the same core message. Discomfort is information. I didn't tell anyone to leave. I didn't tell anyone to stay. I told them to listen to the part of themselves they'd been trained to dismiss. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the napkin Evan had signed. The ink had faded slightly, the paper yellowed at the edges. It felt smaller now, less significant, a relic from a version of my life that no longer existed. I held it for a moment, then folded it once more and placed it back. Not out of sentiment, out of closure. Around that time, my daughter took her first unsteady steps across the living room. Arms outstretched, determined, unafraid of falling. I crouched low, hands ready but not reaching. She stumbled. She steadied herself. She laughed. I felt something loosen in my chest. She would grow up in a world where her instincts were honored, where hesitation wasn't mocked, where strength didn't require spectacle. That mattered more than anything. Weeks later, I learned Evan had left the city. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. The news reached me indirectly, through someone who thought I'd want to know. I thanked them politely and went back to what I was doing. His absence didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. The kind that arrives when the noise finally clears and you can see the shape of things as they truly are. One afternoon, Clara came by with coffee. She looked different, lighter, sharper around the edges. I made a decision, she said. I didn't ask which one. I stopped explaining myself, she continued. It changed everything. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunlight shift across the floor. That silence, shared, safe, unafraid, was the real transformation. As evening settled in, I realized how far I'd come from the woman who once waited for laughter to tell her whether she was allowed to feel hurt. I no longer needed permission. I no longer needed witnesses. I had learned the quiet truth that power doesn't announce itself. It recognizes itself. And once you see it clearly, you never unsee it again. The season turned without asking permission. Leaves fell. Mornings sharpened. Evenings arrived earlier, wrapping the house in a stillness that no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. I stopped measuring progress by events and started noticing it in smaller shifts. The way I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. The way my shoulders stayed relaxed when my phone buzzed. The way silence no longer sounded like judgment. One morning, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single page, typed and signed. It wasn't an apology. It was an explanation, carefully worded, emotionally distant, framed as self-reflection. Lines about misunderstandings and pressure and unintended consequences. It acknowledged impact without admitting intent. Responsibility diluted just enough to remain intact. I read it once. Then I placed it back in the envelope and slid it into a drawer I rarely opened. Not because it mattered, because it didn't. Closure doesn't always come from words. Sometimes it comes from realizing you don't need them anymore. Later that week, I spoke at a small gathering. Not a stage, not a spotlight, just a room with chairs pulled into a loose circle. Faces alert, listening. I didn't tell my story straight through. I never did anymore. I spoke about moments, about patterns that hide in plain sight, about how humor can bruise, about how doubt doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like shrinking. No one interrupted. When I finished, a woman near the window wiped her eyes and said, "I thought it was just me." It never is. That sentence followed me home. That night, after my daughter fell asleep, I stood by her door longer than necessary, watched her chest rise and fall, memorized the softness of her hand curled beneath her cheek. I wasn't building a perfect life. I was building a truthful one. And truth, I'd learned, doesn't need to shout. It just needs room. Weeks later, I passed a familiar restaurant. Laughter spilled out onto the sidewalk. For a moment, memory flickered. Old scenes, old roles, old versions of myself performing ease. I didn't slow down. Not because it didn't matter, because it no longer pulled. Freedom isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with music or declarations. It arrives quietly when your choices stop being reactions. When your body relaxes before your mind catches up. When the past becomes information instead of weight. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook. I am no longer waiting to be believed. I closed the book. Outside, the city moved on indifferent and alive. Inside, something settled into place for good. The story wasn't ending. It was changing ownership. And this time it belonged entirely to me. The first real test came quietly, the way most turning points do. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No surprise confrontations. Just a message that arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in line at the grocery store, balancing a basket on my hip and mentally debating whether I really needed fresh basil. The sender's name made my chest tighten for half a second. Not fear. Recognition. It was someone who had once known me only as an extension. Someone who had learned to speak to me through tone and implication, not respect. Someone who, for years, had treated my silence as consent. The message was polite, carefully neutral, almost friendly. "I heard you've been doing well. Thought maybe we could talk. For old time's sake." I read it twice. Then I put my phone back in my bag and paid for my groceries. That was new. Months earlier, I would have overanalyzed every word, wondered what was expected, drafted and deleted responses in my head, felt that familiar pull, the instinct to smooth, to manage, to keep things calm. Instead, I went home, unpacked my bags, and made soup. Later that night, after the house was quiet and the dishes were done, I took my journal from the drawer and wrote the name at the top of the page. Not out of fear, out of curiosity. Under it, I listed facts. Not feelings. Facts. What that person had taken. What that person had dismissed. What that person had benefited from while claiming innocence. Then I closed the journal. I didn't respond. 2 days later, another message arrived. This one longer. More personal. References to shared memories, mutual acquaintances, nostalgia carefully weaponized. Still, I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, isn't avoidance when it's intentional. It's boundary. A week passed. Then came the phone call. I watched it ring until it stopped. That was when I understood something important. The reach of old power doesn't disappear all at once. It tests. It probes. It waits for reflex. And when the reflex doesn't come, it weakens. Life, meanwhile, kept moving forward in ways that felt almost surreal in their normalcy. I attended parent-teacher meetings without anxiety knotting my stomach. I made decisions without checking how they might be perceived by someone who was no longer present. I started saying no without explanation, and yes without apology. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork at the dining table, I found an old folder tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside were documents I'd once been too intimidated to read on my own. Financial statements, agreements, records that had always been handled for me. I spread them out slowly. This time I understood them. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I saw where assumptions had been made on my behalf, where choices had been framed as favors, where authority had quietly replaced partnership. It wasn't shocking anymore. It was clarifying. I made copies, organized them, filed what needed to be filed, discarded what no longer mattered. Control loses its power when it's named. A few days later, I received an invitation. Not a summons, not a demand, an invitation, a small professional gathering. Someone I'd once worked with, before my world shrank, had reached out. We're putting together a panel. I remembered how sharp you were. Thought you might want to be involved. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Not because I was afraid, because I was surprised. I said yes. The night of the event, I stood in front of a mirror longer than usual, not to perfect myself, but to recognize myself. The woman looking back wasn't rehearsing lines or shrinking posture. She stood evenly, breathed evenly. She belonged in the room she was about to enter, and she knew it. The panel wasn't large. No cameras, no spectacle. But as I spoke, something settled. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't defending a narrative. I was contributing. Afterward, a few people lingered to talk. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, said, "You have a way of explaining things that makes people feel less alone." I thanked her. Later, walking home under streetlights that hummed softly overhead, I felt something close to gratitude for everything that had happened. Not because it should have happened, but because it had ended. The next message arrived the following morning. This one was different, less polite, less controlled. Accusations dressed as concern, questions framed as misunderstandings, a thinly veiled attempt to pull me back into explanation. I read it carefully. Then, for the first time, I responded. Just one line. "I'm not available for this conversation." I didn't add punctuation beyond a period. I didn't soften it. I didn't justify it. I sent it and put my phone down. The reply never came. And that silence, unreturned, unchallenged, felt like the final confirmation that the ground beneath me had shifted for good. That evening, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Why do you smile more now?" I paused, because children don't ask questions casually. They notice patterns adults forget to see. "I think," I said carefully, "because I don't feel lost anymore." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. After she fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, thinking about how strength doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over performance, choosing clarity over chaos, choosing yourself without needing permission. The world hadn't changed, but my place in it had, and that I knew was irreversible. The silence didn't last forever. It never does. But when it broke, it did so differently than before, without the thunder I once feared, without the chaos that used to follow every boundary I set. What came instead was pressure, subtle and strategic, applied through channels I hadn't expected. It started with questions from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. A message from an old acquaintance. "Hey, random question, are you okay?" Someone mentioned you've been acting distant lately. Another from a relative who suddenly remembered my existence. I heard things are tense. Families go through phases, you know. None of them asked what had happened. They asked why I had changed. That's when I realized the narrative had shifted, but not disappeared. When control is lost directly, it often tries to reassert itself indirectly, through concern, through confusion, through other people. I didn't rush to correct anyone. I listened. I let patterns reveal themselves. The same phrases repeated, the same carefully neutral tone, the same implication that harmony depended on my willingness to bend again. It was familiar enough that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I started doing something I'd never done before. I told the truth, briefly. Not explanations. Not defenses. Truths. "Yes, I'm okay." "No, I'm not discussing that. I'm focusing on my life right now." Some people accepted that easily. Those relationships survived. Others pushed. Those didn't. And I learned something important in the process. Relationships that only function when one person stays quiet aren't relationships. They're arrangements. The professional side of my life, however, was moving in the opposite direction. The panel appearance turned into a follow-up invitation, then another, then a request to consult on a short-term project. Nothing overwhelming, nothing that demanded I sacrifice balance, but enough to remind me that the parts of me I'd been told were too much had always been valuable. One afternoon, while reviewing notes at my kitchen table, I caught myself smiling again. Not the practiced kind, the real kind that arrives without asking permission. That evening, I received a call I didn't expect. A number I recognized instantly but hadn't saved. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail. The voice was calm, measured, familiar in a way that once would have sent my heart racing. No anger, no apology, just certainty. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the voice said. "I'd like to clear it up. We don't need to make this more complicated than it already is." I sat there long after the message ended, not shaking, not crying, thinking, because this wasn't an attempt to reconnect. It was an attempt to reframe, to turn distance into drama, boundaries into conflict, clarity into confusion. And I wasn't confused anymore. I didn't respond that night. Instead, I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke early and took my daughter for a walk before school. The air was cool, the sky pale with that soft light that only exists for a few minutes each day. She skipped ahead, pointing out things I'd stopped noticing for years. Interesting leaves, a crack in the sidewalk, shaped like a star. "You miss a lot when you're thinking too hard," she said casually. I stopped walking. "Where did you hear that?" I asked. She shrugged. "I didn't. I just know." Children have a way of naming truths adults complicate. After dropping her off, I went home and finally returned the call. Not with emotion, with intention. "I got your message," I said calmly when the call connected. "There's no misunderstanding. I'm choosing not to engage." There was a pause, then a laugh, soft, disbelieving. "You're being dramatic." There it was, the oldest trick in the book. "I'm being clear," I replied. "That's different." Another pause. "You're really going to do this?" "I already have." I ended the call before the next line could be delivered. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. I sat there for a moment afterward, noticing how quiet the house felt, not empty, just calm, as if the walls themselves were relieved. Later that week, something unexpected happened. An email arrived from a legal office. Formal, neutral, carefully worded. Someone had decided to test me. Not directly, but officially. I read it twice, then forwarded it to someone I trusted. Someone who understood documents, language, implications. The response came quickly. "This isn't a threat," they said. "It's a bluff." And a weak one. That made me laugh out loud for the first time in days. Power, I was learning, often depends on the assumption that the other person doesn't know their options. Once you do, everything changes. We responded once. Clearly, briefly, correcting the record without emotion. The matter dissolved quietly. No follow-up. No escalation. And that was the moment it truly sank in. The fear I used to carry had been doing more work than the people who relied on it. Without it, there was very little left. Life settled into a new rhythm. Not perfect, not dramatic, but honest. I cooked more, read more, said no more often, and yes when it mattered. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, searching for where I'd gone wrong. Instead, I noticed how much energy I now had for things that actually belonged to me. One evening, as I was cleaning out an old storage box, I found something I'd forgotten about entirely. A letter. One I'd written years ago, but never sent. It was full of questions, apologies, attempts to be understood. I read it once. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the shredder. Closure doesn't always require conversation. Sometimes it requires release. The final confirmation came quietly, the way all lasting changes do. Weeks passed with no messages, no calls, no intermediaries. The world had moved on, and so had I. One night, as I stood by the window watching city lights blink on one by one, I felt something settle into place, not triumph, not satisfaction. Peace, not the fragile kind that depends on silence, the sturdy kind that survives noise. I hadn't won anything. I had reclaimed something, and no one could take it back. The first real test of my new life came without warning. Not with confrontation, not with drama, with absence. There were no more messages filtered through friends. No legal letters wrapped in polite language. No accidental encounters or sudden concern. The silence stretched, not tense, not threatening, just empty. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence can be confirmation. When control fails, interest fades. That realization didn't hurt the way I once thought it would. It clarified things. It stripped away the last illusion that what I had endured was ever about love, misunderstanding, or miscommunication. It had always been about access. And access was gone. Life began to feel wider. Mornings were no longer rushed by anxiety. Evenings weren't spent replaying conversations or preparing for arguments that might never come but always hovered. I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't affected by them. I stopped apologizing for being calm. The professional momentum continued steadily. Not explosive, not overwhelming, just consistent. The kind of growth that feels earned rather than accidental. I was invited to speak at a small conference, then another. One of the organizers pulled me aside afterward and said something that stayed with me. "You don't speak like someone trying to prove anything," she said. "You speak like someone who already knows who they are." That hadn't always been true, but it was becoming true. At home, the changes were quieter but deeper. My daughter started sleeping through the night. Her teachers mentioned she seemed more confident, more willing to speak up in class. One afternoon, she came home and announced she'd corrected another student who told her she was too bossy. "I'm not bossy," she said matter-of-factly. "I just know what I want." I smiled, but my throat tightened. Children learn boundaries by watching how we protect ours. One evening, months after the last contact, I received a message from someone I didn't expect. Not an apology, not an explanation. A question. "Are you happy?" That was it. No greeting. No context. I stared at the screen for a long time. Once, I would have answered carefully, softened the truth, tried to manage the other person's reaction. This time I typed 3 words. "Yes, I am." Then I put my phone down and never checked to see if there was a response. Because happiness doesn't need witnesses. The final loose end tied itself up shortly after. A mutual acquaintance, someone who had always hovered at the edge of things, ran into me at a bookstore. We exchanged polite smiles, the kind people use when they share history, but not intimacy. "You seem different," they said cautiously. "Different how?" I asked. "Lighter," they replied. "Like, you don't carry things anymore." I thought about that. "I still carry things," I said. "Just not what doesn't belong to me." They nodded, not fully understanding, but respectful enough not to push. And that was enough. The last scene didn't happen in a courtroom or over a dinner table. It didn't involve raised voices or dramatic revelations. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was walking home, grocery bag in one hand, keys in the other, when I passed a reflective storefront window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman walking toward me. Her posture was different, her face calm, her steps unhurried. She looked grounded. It took me a second to realize it was me. Not the version shaped by criticism or expectation. Not the one who braced herself before speaking. Just me. I stopped walking and stood there for a moment, watching my reflection as people passed behind it, their lives intersecting mine for a split second before moving on. And I felt something close, not to victory, but to closure. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. I went home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, laughed at a silly show we both pretended wasn't funny. Later, after the lights were off and the house settled into its nighttime hush, I sat alone with a cup of tea. No plans, no strategies, no rehearsed responses, just quiet. The story that once revolved around proving something to someone else had ended. A new one, simpler, stronger, had already begun. And this time, I was the one writing it. If my story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Tap subscribe, share where you're watching from, and leave a comment. Your support helps stories like this reach people who need strength, clarity, and courage.